Glass exploded across the boardwalk before anyone spoke. The sound cut through the morning and left the whole street frozen. A cracked window hung in the front of the general store. Tiny pieces glittered on the ground. She did it again. Look at her. Crazy woman. The whispers moved faster than the dust. The widow stood in front of the broken window. She did not run. She did not look sorry. One hand held a stone. The other held an old folded letter with soft edges and water stains. Her dark coat hung loose around her shoulders. Her eyes stayed fixed on the store. People gathered in doorways. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Why is she always angry? Hush! The store owner pushed through the front door and stared at the damage. You out of your mind? The widow lifted the letter. Tell your brother to stop lying. The owner stiffened. His lies aren't. The crowd fell quiet. The owner stepped closer. You break my window over a dead man? I broke it over what he did. You got proof? She raised the letter again. I got enough. The owner reached for it. She pulled it away. Give me that. No, it belongs to my family. It belongs to the truth. The owner looked around at the watching faces. She's been causing trouble for years. The widow laughed once. Years? Funny. That's exactly how long you've been hiding. A few people lowered their eyes. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody stepped between them. The widow could feel the town judging her before she even opened her mouth. They saw a woman alone. A woman who spoke too loudly. A woman who refused to bow her head. They never asked why. The owner pointed toward the road. Get off my property. Make me. The sound of boots approached from behind the crowd. People moved aside. The sheriff arrived. His badge caught the light. His face looked tired, but not tired enough. He studied the broken glass. Then he looked at the widow. You want to sell tonight? Maybe I want the truth. You always want something. Only because nobody gives answers. The sheriff held out his hand. Give me the rock. She dropped it at his feet. Happy? No, me neither. A few nervous laughs came from the crowd. The sheriff ignored them. You can't keep doing this. And they can? That's not how this works. That's exactly how it works. The owner folded his arms. She needs locking up. The widow looked straight at him. You nervous? About what? About what's in this letter. The owner went silent. The sheriff noticed. What letter? None of your business. Everything in this town is my business. She held the paper against her chest. That's the problem, children whispered behind a wagon. Old women watched from a porch. Men stood with crossed arms and hard faces. The widow knew every expression. She had seen them after her husband died. Pity for a week, judgment forever after. Nobody talked much about the accident anymore. Nobody talked about the wagon that supposedly slipped. Nobody talked about the witnesses who changed their stories. Nobody talked about the missing records. Silence had become the town's favorite language. The sheriff stepped closer. Go home. What if I don't? Then I'll make a choice neither of us likes. The widow stared at him. For a moment she wondered if he knew what was inside the letter. Then she wondered if he already knew. The thought sat heavy in her stomach. Finally she turned away. The crowd parted. Nobody touched her. Nobody greeted her. The whispers returned the second she started walking. Troublemaker. She brings bad luck. Always has. The widow kept moving. She had heard worse. The letter crackled softly in her hand. Her husband had hidden it years ago. She found it inside an old toolbox beneath loose boards in the barn. Half the ink had faded, but one thing remained clear. A name, the store owner's brother. The same man who had sworn he knew nothing before the accident. The same man who suddenly died months later. The same man whose records disappeared. The widow followed the dirt road out of town. The voices faded behind her. Ahead stood the old graveyard. Most people avoided it. The fence leaned crooked. Several stones had fallen. Grass-covered names nobody remembered. She walked past the gate. A strange feeling stopped her after only a few steps. Something had changed. She looked toward a grave near the back. It belonged to a ranch hand who died decades ago. Nobody visited him. Nobody left flowers. Yet fresh flowers rested against the stone, bright, clean, placed carefully. The widow frowned. She moved closer. The petals were new. Not a day old. She looked around. No body, only silence. A breeze touched the grass. She unfolded the letter once more. The paper trembled between her fingers. A corner carried dried mud, as if someone had dropped it during a storm. She read the same lines again. Nothing changed. The name stayed there. The warning stayed there. So did the date, written only 3 days before her husband died. Her chest tightened. She remembered him sitting at the kitchen table. She remembered the lamp burning low. "If anything happens, keep looking," he had said. At the time, she thought he was talking about money, work, another hard season. Now the words felt different. Now they felt like a door opening somewhere in the dark. The widow folded the letter carefully and slipped it back inside her coat slowly. She crouched beside the grave. "Who came here?" No answer. Her eyes drifted downward. There, pressed into the dirt beside the flowers, was a single boot print. Large, fresh, different from the town boots she knew. The heel carried a worn pattern shaped like a star. The widow touched the edge of the print. Someone had been here. Someone who cared enough to bring flowers to a forgotten grave, someone she had never seen before. For the first time that day, her anger loosened its grip. Only slightly, only for a moment. Then she looked at the boot print again and wondered who was walking through the town's buried secrets. The widow touched the edge of the boot print and wondered who was walking through the town's buried secrets. The mark sat fresh in the dirt beside the forgotten grave. It was too clean to be old, too deep to have been made days ago. Someone had stood here recently. Someone had left flowers where nobody ever came. She remained crouched beside the stone and studied the print again. The worn star pattern on the heel looked familiar somehow, though she could not place it. The flowers smelled fresh. White petals rested against weathered stone. The dead ranch hand's name was barely readable beneath years of dirt and rain. The widow glanced around the graveyard. Nothing moved, no voices, no visitors. Only leaning headstones and quiet grass. Then a voice appeared behind her. "Looking for somebody?" She stood immediately and turned. A man leaned against the old fence near the edge of the graveyard. He wore a dust-covered hat and a faded coat. His boots matched the print in the dirt. The widow stared at him. He stared back, neither smiled, neither looked away. "You leave those flowers?" "Maybe. Maybe isn't an answer. Depends on the question." She folded her arms. "Why?" The man looked toward the grave. "Some graves shouldn't stay lonely." The widow studied his face. He looked older than she first thought. Not old, just tired. The kind of tired that settled behind a person's eyes and stayed there. "You know him?" "Not really." "Then why come here?" The cowboy shrugged. "Someone should." The widow glanced at the flowers. "You don't even know his name." "I know enough." "What's enough?" "That nobody else remembers him." The answer caught her off guard. The widow looked back at the grave. For years she had walked past it. For years everyone had. The cowboy stepped away from the fence. "You're the widow. You know who I am. Hard not to. Because of today? Because of every day." She laughed once. There was no humor in it. "Then you already heard the stories." "Plenty. And you're still standing here." "So far." The widow narrowed her eyes. "Most people leave. Most people aren't me." Silence settled between them. The cowboy looked toward town. The church bell rang in the distance. A dog barked somewhere beyond the trees. Life continued while they stood among the dead. The widow finally spoke. "You from around here?" "No." "Passing through?" "No, then why stay?" The cowboy shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "Bought a ranch." She frowned. "What ranch?" "The old Parker place." The widow stared. Nobody had lived there in years. The ranch sat abandoned beyond the hills. The house was falling apart. The barn leaned sideways. Most people thought the place carried bad luck. "You bought that?" "Seems I did." "Why?" "It was cheap." "That's a terrible reason. Worked anyway." The widow shook her head. "People said that place was cursed. People say lots of things. They aren't always wrong. The cowboy looked at her. "Neither are you." She wasn't sure what to do with that answer. Most conversations in town followed a pattern. People avoided her, judged her, feared her. This man did none of those things. It unsettled her more than anger ever could. The cowboy nodded toward town. "They warned me about you," the widow sighed. "What they say that you're wild, and?" They seemed more scared than honest. The widow looked away. The words landed harder than she expected. Nobody had ever said that to her face. People called her difficult, dangerous, broken, crazy. But scared, that felt closer to the truth. Maybe they should be scared. Maybe. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm not." She watched him carefully. "Why not?" The cowboy scratched his jaw. "Because angry people don't worry me. What worries you?" "Quiet people." The widow almost smiled. Almost. "You don't know anything about me." "Probably true. You think everyone else is wrong?" "I think towns get comfortable with stories. And stories aren't always facts." The graveyard grew quiet again. A breeze moved through the grass. The flowers shifted slightly beside the stone. The widow found herself wondering who this man had been before arriving here. Nobody bought the Parker Ranch without a reason. Nobody visited forgotten graves for no reason either. "You got a name?" "Sure." He gave it. She repeated it once. The name meant nothing to her. No family connections, no local history. Just a stranger. "What about you?" he asked. "You already know my name. I know what people call you." "And? I was asking what you call yourself." The question lingered. Nobody had asked her that in a long time. Eventually, she answered. The cowboy nodded. "Nice to meet you. Don't get used to it." "I'll try." The widow looked down at the grave again. "Why this one?" The cowboy's expression changed slightly, not fear. Not sadness, something harder to read. "Because somebody once did the same thing for someone I knew." "Who?" "A good man. What happened to him?" The cowboy looked toward the road. "Same thing that happens to most good men." He started walking away. The widow watched him move through the gate. "You always answer questions with riddles, only the important ones. That doesn't make any sense." "Maybe later." He continued toward the road. The widow stood alone among the graves. For a moment she considered calling him back. Instead, she remained where she was. The cowboy reached the road and adjusted his hat. Several townspeople passing nearby watched him with open suspicion. One man spat into the dirt. A woman pulled her child closer. The cowboy ignored all of them. He kept walking. The widow looked back toward the forgotten grave. Something caught her eye. Another flower rested beside the others. She was certain it had not been there before. She stepped closer. The stem sat awkwardly against the stone, almost as if it had been placed in a hurry. The widow crouched again. Her fingers brushed beneath the flower. Something thin hid underneath, old paper. She carefully pulled it free. A torn piece of a document emerged from beneath the petals. The edges were yellow, the writing had faded, but not completely. Her pulse quickened. The paper carried an official county seal. She immediately recognized it. The widow looked toward the road. The cowboy had nearly disappeared beyond the trees. Had he left it? Had he wanted her to find it? Or had someone else hidden it there? The questions crowded her mind. She unfolded the torn paper slowly. The faded words began to appear. And as the cowboy disappeared down the road, the widow stared at the county document and realized she was no longer chasing a rumor. She was standing at the edge of something real. The widow unfolded the torn paper slowly. The faded words began to appear, and as the cowboy disappeared down the road, she realized she was no longer chasing a rumor. She was standing at the edge of something real. The county seal sat near the top of the page. Below it were names, dates, and property records. Most of the paper had been ripped away, but enough remained to make her uneasy. She read the first name, then the second. Then the third. Her eyes narrowed. The same family name appeared again and again, the governor's family. The widow turned the paper over. Nothing. She looked back at the front. Land transfers, burial changes. ownership claims, several signatures, several missing signatures. The missing spaces bothered her most. Records were supposed to be complete. This one wasn't. She folded the document and slipped it into her coat beside her husband's letter. The walk to town felt different now. People still watched her. People still whispered. But she barely noticed. Her thoughts stayed fixed on the paper, on the names, on the missing signatures. By the time she reached the courthouse, the afternoon sun sat low over the rooftops. The building stood at the center of town like it always had. Old brick, tall windows. A clock that rarely kept proper time. The widow climbed the steps. Two men sitting outside stopped talking when they saw her. One shook his head. The other looked away. She pushed through the front doors. The courthouse smelled like dust and old paper. The clerk sat behind a counter near the records room. The moment he saw her, his shoulders tightened. "You shouldn't be here." "I know, then leave." "Not yet." The clerk sighed heavily. "We've been through this." "No, you avoided this. There's nothing here for you." "How do you know?" "Because I've worked here 20 years. The widow stepped closer. "And how many years have things gone missing?" The clerk looked away. That was answer enough. The widow noticed. "So they have. You should go." "Not until I see the archives." "You need permission." "From who?" The clerk hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than words. "From who?" she repeated. The clerk finally answered. "The county office." "The county office is 3 rooms away. They make the rules." "No, they hide behind them." The clerk rubbed his forehead. "You always make things harder, only for liars." The clerk opened his mouth to argue. A familiar voice interrupted. "Need a witness?" The widow turned. The cowboy stood near the entrance. Dust still covered his boots. His hat sat low over his eyes. The clerk looked annoyed immediately. "You again?" The cowboy smiled slightly. "Missed me?" "No." The widow folded her arms. "What are you doing here?" The cowboy shrugged. "Thought you might need help. Need a miracle." "Can't promise one." "Then you're probably useless. Wouldn't be the first time." The widow almost smiled. The clerk noticed and looked even more uncomfortable. "Both of you need to leave." The cowboy leaned on the counter. Or I'll get the sheriff." The cowboy nodded. "Good. What?" "Maybe he can help us find missing records." The clerk's face changed, only for a second, but both of them saw it. The widow stepped closer. "You know exactly what we're looking for." "I don't." "You do." "I don't." The cowboy spoke quietly. "Then let us look." The clerk hesitated. Seconds passed. Finally, he grabbed a ring of keys. "I'll regret this." "Probably," the widow said. He led them through a narrow hallway. Dust covered the floor. Old portraits hung crooked on the walls. Most showed former county officials. Several shared the same family names. The widow noticed. The cowboy noticed too. Neither commented. The records room waited at the end of the hall. Rows of shelves filled the space. Boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. Decades of county history sat hidden beneath dust. The clerk unlocked the door. "You get 1 hour." "We won't need that long," the widow said. The clerk laughed nervously. "You might." He left. The door closed behind him. Silence settled over the room. The widow immediately opened the torn document again. The cowboy stood beside her. "You recognize any names?" "A few." "Important people?" "Too important." They began searching property records, tax files, transfer documents, year after year, name after name. The same families appeared repeatedly. Large ranch owners, county officials, business partners. Land that changed hands overnight. Land sold for almost nothing. Land taken from families who suddenly disappeared from records. The widow's stomach tightened. "This isn't right." "No, look at this." She handed a file to the cowboy. He studied it, then frowned. "Page numbers jump." "What?" "See?" She looked page 47, then 49, then 52. Several pages were missing. The widow grabbed another file. The same thing, another, the same, another. Again, the realization hit hard. Someone had removed pages from the archives. Not one file, Many years of records, years of evidence. The widow sat down heavily at a nearby table. The room suddenly felt smaller. The cowboy watched her carefully. "You okay?" "No." She stared at the files. Her husband had spent months investigating local land disputes before his death. At the time, she thought he was chasing another county mistake. Nothing more. Now the memory returned differently. She remembered long nights, stackers of papers, arguments at the dinner table, his frustration, his fear. Most of all, his silence near the end. The silence he never explained. The widow looked at the cowboy. "He was investigating this. Your husband?" She nodded. "He kept talking about stolen land." The cowboy listened quietly. He said records didn't match. "What happened?" "I told him to stop." The words hurt to say. "I thought he was obsessed. You didn't know." "No," her voice cracked. "I didn't know." The cowboy pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "He probably kept digging." "Yes, probably found something." "Yes." The widow stared at the missing files. A cold feeling settled inside her chest. Not grief, not anger. Something worse. Fear, the kind that arrives when scattered pieces suddenly fit together. Her husband hadn't been reckless. He hadn't been confused. He hadn't imagined things. He had been right. The widow looked toward the shelves, then toward the torn document, then toward the missing pages. A terrible possibility formed. What if it wasn't an accident? The cowboy didn't answer immediately. The silence felt heavy. Finally he spoke. "What if it wasn't?" The widow looked away. The room seemed darker now. Every missing page felt deliberate. Every missing signature felt planned. Every name felt connected. The governor's family. Powerful ranch owners, county officials. And somewhere among them sat the truth about her husband's death. Neither of them noticed the hallway growing quiet outside. Neither heard the clerk leave his desk. Neither saw a shadow pass the frosted glass window in the door. The widow reached for another file. Then suddenly the courthouse lights went dark around them. The courthouse lights went dark around them. For a second, neither moved. The records room vanished into blackness. The widow gripped the edge of the table. The cowboy stood slowly. What was that? Power outage? Convenient. The widow listened. The building felt wrong. Too quiet. No voices in the hallway, no footsteps, no sounds from outside, only silence. Then, just as suddenly, the lights returned. The old bulbs flickered overhead. Everything snapped back into view. The widow exhaled. The cowboy looked toward the door. Nobody there. Maybe somebody wanted us to think there was. The widow looked down at the open file in front of her. Something had shifted when the lights went out. Several papers now leaned sideways. One damaged folder had slipped from the shelf beside her chair. Its contents spilled across the floor. The cowboy crouched first. "Hold on." "What?" He reached beneath the fallen papers. "There's something here." The widow joined him. A folded piece of yellowed paper sat hidden inside the folder lining. It looked older than everything else. Someone had tucked it away years ago, maybe decades. The widow carefully unfolded it. The paper revealed a hand-drawn map. Faded, precise, the cowboy studied it. "What is it?" The widow followed the markings. A church, a road, a cluster of ranch boundaries. Then a dark circle marked behind the church grounds. Her pulse quickened. "A well." The cowboy nodded slowly. "Looks abandoned." The widow pointed toward several initials written beside the drawing. The same initials appeared in the property records, the same names connected to missing pages, connected to stolen land, connected to powerful families. The cowboy looked at her. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yes." "That somebody hid this?" "Yes." "That somebody didn't want it found?" "Yes." They stared at the map. Neither needed convincing. The answer waited somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. That evening, the town settled into darkness. Porch lights glowed across the streets. One closed, doors locked. The widow sat alone at her kitchen table. The map rested beside her husband's letter. She could not stop looking at it. Every road felt familiar. Every mark felt deliberate. Someone had buried a secret. Someone expected it to stay buried. A knock came at the door. She already knew who it was. The cowboy stepped inside moments later. Neither wasted time. The map sat between them. "You ready?" "No." "Good. Why?" "Means you're paying attention." The widow folded the map. "You always talk like that?" Unfortunately, they left together. The road behind the church stretched through tall grass and broken fencing. The church itself stood empty at night. Its windows reflected moonlight. Its bell tower leaned slightly with age. Few people visited after sunset. Even fewer visited the land behind it. Old stories surrounded the place. Children whispered about them. Adults pretended not to. The widow and the cowboy crossed the churchyard quietly. The map guided them. A narrow path appeared beyond the rear fence. Overgrown weeds brushed against their boots. Branches scraped softly overhead. The farther they walked, the quieter everything became. Finally the well appeared. It sat hidden among trees. Stone walls circled its opening. Most of the wood cover had rotted away years ago. The structure looked forgotten, but not abandoned. The widow immediately noticed signs of use, fresh footprints, recently disturbed dirt. Someone still came here. The cowboy circled the well slowly. "What do you think?" "I think somebody didn't want this place found." "Then we're in the right place." The widow stepped closer. Moonlight revealed marks carved into the stone. Hundreds of them, names, initials, dates, generations of scratches layered across one another. The cowboy brushed dirt away. "There." The widow knelt beside him. Several initials matched the records from the courthouse. The governor's family. Old ranch owners, county officials. Names that appeared repeatedly across decades of land transfers. The widow touched one carving carefully. "Why leave these?" Maybe they thought nobody would notice. Or maybe they wanted somebody to. The cowboy looked into the darkness below. The well seemed deeper than expected. The black opening swallowed the light. The widow leaned forward. Cold air drifted upward. Then she heard something, a faint sound, almost impossible to catch. She froze. The sound came again. A distant voice, barely a whisper. Her heart began to race. The cowboy noticed immediately. "You okay?" She listened harder. The voice seemed to rise from somewhere below. Not loud, not clear, but familiar, painfully familiar. Her husband's voice. The widow stepped backward. The sound vanished, then returned. A broken fragment of words, soft far away. She could not make out the sentence. Only the voice itself, the same voice she had spent years missing. The same voice she heard in dreams. Her chest tightened. The cowboy looked at her carefully. "You hear that?" The widow swallowed. "No." The lie came instantly. The cowboy kept watching her. "You sure?" "Yes," the voice returned. Stronger this time. Not real. It couldn't be real. The widow knew that, yet her skin prickled anyway. The well seemed to breathe around her. The trees stood completely still. Every old story she had ever dismissed suddenly felt closer. The cowboy moved nearer to the opening. "There's something down there." The widow forced herself forward. "Maybe." "Not maybe." He pointed. A dull reflection glimmered far below. Middle, the widow saw it too. Something rested inside the well, partially hidden beneath debris. The cowboy removed a rope from his saddlebag. "You carry rope everywhere?" "Mostly, because life keeps proving me right." The widow helped secure it. Minutes later, the cowboy carefully lowered himself partway down the stone wall. The rope strained, loose rocks shifted. The widow held tight. "See it?" "Yes." "What is it?" "Looks like a box." The widow's pulse quickened. The cowboy reached downward. For several tense seconds neither spoke. Then his voice echoed upward. "Got it." The widow pulled with him, slowly, carefully. The weight rose from the darkness. A rusted metal box emerged from the well. Water dripped from its surface. Mud covered its sides. The widow stared. The cowboy climbed out and dropped beside the box. Both sat breathing hard. Neither spoke immediately. The object rested between them, silent, waiting. The widow wiped away years of dirt. A small latch appeared. The metal groaned when she touched it. "You ready?" the cowboy asked. "No? Good." The widow shook her head. "You really need new answers. Working on it." Together they lifted the latch. The lid opened slowly. Moonlight spilled across the contents. The widow froze. The cowboy froze. Inside the box sat dozens of hidden letters, stacked carefully, protected for years, waiting in darkness for someone to finally find them. Inside the box sat dozens of hidden letters stacked carefully, protected for years, waiting in darkness for someone to finally find them. The widow stared at the papers without moving. Her hands trembled slightly. The cowboy sat beside her near the old well. Moonlight spilled across the letters and revealed names written on envelopes stained by age and damp air. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt heavy. The widow finally reached for the top letter. The paper crackled as she opened it. A handwritten statement filled the page. She read quietly, then read it again. "What is it?" the cowboy asked. "A confession." "From who?" "A ranch owner." She handed it to him. The cowboy scanned the page, his jaw tightened. The letter described land taken from a family after false debt claims were filed against them. The family lost everything. Their ranch changed ownership within weeks. The new owner shared a last name with one of the county officials. The widow grabbed another letter, then another. Each one revealed something worse. Threats, bribes, missing records, arrests, families forced off property, witnesses pressured into silence. The deeper they looked, the darker the story became. "This wasn't one man," the widow said. "No. This was organized." "Yes." The cowboy opened another envelope, his eyes narrowed. "Look at this." The widow took it. A mother described her husband's arrest after refusing to sell land. The charges were fabricated. The evidence vanished afterward. The sheriff at the time signed the report. The signature matched the name of the current sheriff's father. The widow stared at the page. Her stomach twisted. He was involved. "Looks that way." He helped them. "Looks that way too." The widow looked toward the church. Everything she believed about the town felt unstable now. The stories she had dismissed, the rumors, the whispers. They suddenly carried weight. Another letter revealed a ranch burned under suspicious circumstances. Another described a witness who disappeared. Another detailed forged signatures on county transfers. Every page connected powerful people. Every page pointed toward the same circle of families. The widow continued searching. Hours seemed to pass. The pile of letters grew. The truth grew with it. Then she stopped. One envelope sat near the bottom. Her breath caught. She recognized the handwriting immediately. The cowboy noticed. "What is it?" The widow didn't answer. She already knew. Slowly she opened the envelope. Inside rested several folded pages. The handwriting belonged to her husband. The room around her seemed to disappear. The church, the trees, the well. Everything faded except those pages. She unfolded the first sheet. The date sat near the top. Only 2 days before his death. The widow began reading. The words were hurried, uneven, as if written by someone running out of time. He described missing county records. Secret land transfers, meetings between ranch owners and officials. Names she already recognized. Names she had seen throughout the night. Then she reached the final page. The writing became rougher. The sentences shorter, the message unfinished. The final line stopped halfway through a sentence. The widow lowered the paper. He knew. The cowboy looked at the pages. Looks like he did. He found everything. Maybe not everything. "Enough." The cowboy nodded. "Enough." The widow stared at the unfinished sentence. Her husband had been close, closer than she ever imagined. Not chasing rumors, not chasing mistakes. Chasing proof. And somebody had known it. He died for this. The cowboy remained quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. "Then let's make it matter." The widow looked at him. His voice carried no pity, no false comfort. Only certainty. For the first time in years, someone spoke about her husband without treating him like a tragedy. That mattered more than she expected. The widow folded the pages carefully. The cowboy leaned back against the well stones. You loved him. It wasn't a question. Yes. What was he like? The widow looked toward the dark trees. At first, she didn't answer. Then the words came. He laughed too loud. The cowboy smiled. That's not a crime. Some people thought it was. What else? He trusted everybody. That sounds dangerous. It was. The widow held the letter tightly. He always believed people would do the right thing. And you? I believed people would disappoint you. Which one of you was right? The widow laughed softly. Neither of them missed the sadness in it. I think we both were. The cowboy nodded. The answers seemed honest enough. The widow stared at the unfinished page. He wanted children. The cowboy looked over. You didn't? I did. Her voice grew quieter. We kept waiting. For what? A better year. The cowboy lowered his eyes. The widow continued. There was always something. Money. Yes. Work. Yes. Trouble. Always. The widow swallowed hard. We thought we'd have time. The words hurt, more than she expected. The cowboy said nothing. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer easy answers. The widow appreciated that. Most people rushed to fill silence. He let it exist. The tears arrived without warning, small at first, then impossible to stop. The widow looked away immediately. Embarrassment hit harder than grief. She hated crying in front of people, especially strangers, especially after years of teaching herself not to. The cowboy remained still. You don't have to carry it alone. The widow wiped her eyes quickly. I forgot what that sounded like. You shouldn't have had to. The widow laughed through the tears. Careful. What? You keep saying smart things. Must be getting sick. That earned the first real smile she had shown all night. Small, brief. But real, the cowboy noticed. He didn't mention it. The widow looked down at the letters again. So many lives, so many ruined families. So many people buried beneath decades of lies. For years she believed her grief belonged only to her. Now she understood it belonged to a much larger story. The town itself carried wounds, generations of them, and somebody had worked hard to keep those wounds hidden. The widow gathered the letters into careful stacks. We need copies. Yes. We need proof. Yes. We need somewhere safe. Yes. You always agree this much. Only when you're right. The widow shook her head. That's annoying. People tell me that often. They continued organizing the letters, names, dates, confessions, evidence, enough to destroy reputations, enough to expose powerful families, enough to explain why someone hid the box inside the well. The widow placed her husband's letter at the top of the pile. The unfinished sentence stared back at her. This time she didn't feel helpless, angry. Yes. Heartbroken always, but helpless no longer. Then the cowboy suddenly looked toward the distant road. His expression changed instantly. The widow noticed. What? He stood. Listen. The widow heard it a second later. An engine, far away, growing louder. Headlights appeared between distant trees, one pair, then another, moving toward the church, moving toward the well. The widow rose slowly. The letters sat exposed beside them. The cowboy's eyes stayed fixed on the approaching lights. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Someone knew they had found the letters. Someone knew they had found the letters. The headlights moved closer through the darkness beyond the church. One pair became two, two became three. Engines growled across the dirt road. The widow grabbed the stack of letters immediately. The cowboy stood beside her. Take the box. You take it. You found them. You own the horse. That isn't an argument. The widow shoved the letters into a canvas sack. Move. The vehicles rolled into view. 3 trucks. No markings, no hesitation. The engine stopped. Doors opened. Several men climbed out. The widow recognized some faces. Not friends, not strangers. Men tied to ranch owners. Men tied to county offices. Men who never spoke much in public. One stepped forward. You found something that doesn't belong to you. The widow tightened her grip on the sack. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. The man's expression hardened. Hand it over. No. Another man stepped forward. The cowboy moved beside her. "No, we understand perfectly." The first man looked at him. "This isn't your fight." The cowboy nodded. "Probably. Then leave." "No." The men exchanged looks. The widow noticed something important. They were nervous, not angry, nervous. That made her more dangerous than any weapon. The first man pointed toward the sack. "Last chance." The widow stared at him. "Go to hell." For a second, nobody moved. Then the cowboy grabbed her arm. "Time to go." The widow didn't argue. Both turned and ran. Shouting erupted behind them. Boots pounded against dirt. The cowboy led her through the trees. Branches snapped. Leaves scraped their faces. The sack bounced against her side. Several voices followed behind them. "Stop! Get them! Move!" The widow ran harder. The church disappeared behind them. The road opened ahead. The cowboy's horse waited near the fence. They climbed up fast. The cowboy snapped the reins. The horse surged forward. The voices faded behind them. Soon only darkness remained. Neither spoke until the church vanished completely. The widow finally looked back. Nothing, no headlights, no pursuit. Only distant shadows. The cowboy exhaled. Well, what? They weren't friendly. The widow almost laughed. Almost, hours later, the first glow appeared on the horizon, not sunrise fire. The cowboy saw it first. His face changed instantly. The widow followed his gaze. A bright orange glow burned beyond the hills. The direction made her stomach drop. The ranch. "Tell me that's not yours." The cowboy kept staring. "It's mine." They pushed the horse harder. The glow grew larger. Smoke filled the sky. By the time they reached the property, flames towered above the barn. The fire roared through dry wood. Wending exploded. Roof beams collapsed. Heat slammed into them. Several horses ran loose across the pasture. Cattle scattered through broken fencing. Neighbors stood nearby with buckets and shovels. Too little, too late. The widow jumped down first. "Get the animals." The cowboy already moved. Together they worked through smoke and chaos, ropes, gates, panicked livestock, flying embers. The widow coughed through the smoke. The fire consumed everything in its path. The old barn groaned. Then part of the roof collapsed inward. A wave of sparks burst into the sky. Several people stepped back. Nobody could save the building now. Eventually, the worst of the fire burned itself out. Only blackened ruins remained. The widow stood beside the cowboy. Both stared at the wreckage. The smell of smoke covered everything. The cowboy wiped soot from his face. "They're scared." The widow looked toward the destroyed barn. "They should be." The cowboy nodded slowly. Neither needed to say who they meant. The sound of another vehicle approached. The sheriff arrived. His truck rolled onto the property. Several townspeople watched carefully. The sheriff stepped out. Concern filled his face, or something that looked like concern. "Everybody all right?" Nobody answered immediately. The sheriff walked toward the ruins. "What happened?" The cowboy folded his arms. "You tell us." The sheriff ignored that. He studied the damage, then he looked at the widow. "Where were you tonight?" The question landed strangely. The widow noticed immediately. The sheriff wasn't asking if they were safe. He was asking where they had been. "Why?" Routine question. "Since when?" The sheriff glanced away. The widow kept watching. Something felt wrong. Then he spoke again. "Did they take the letters?" Silence. The widow felt her heartbeat slow. The sheriff realized his mistake the second the words left his mouth. The cowboy noticed too. "What letters?" The sheriff recovered quickly. "Rumors." "No," the widow said. The sheriff looked at her. "No, what? You knew." "Careful." The widow stepped closer. "No." Several townspeople turned toward them. The conversation had become public. Nobody walked away. Nobody pretended not to listen. The widow pointed toward the burned barn. "You knew exactly what they were after." "That's nonsense." "Then how'd you know about letters?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I hear things." "From who?" No answer. The widow took another step. "From the same people who burned this ranch?" "Watch yourself." "Why?" "Because accusations have consequences." The widow laughed bitterly. So does murder. The crowd reacted instantly. Several people exchanged uneasy looks. One older rancher lowered his head. A woman standing near the fence whispered something to her husband. The sheriff noticed the shift. The widow noticed it too. For the first time, doubt appeared in the crowd. Not certainty, not support. Just doubt. And doubt was dangerous. The sheriff tried to regain control. You've been stirring up trouble for years. The widow shook her head. No. Yes, no. The sheriff stared at her. The widow refused to look away. You're afraid, the sheriff laughed. Of you? Of what's coming? The silence that followed felt heavy. Nobody rushed to defend him. Nobody rushed to defend her either. But the balance had changed. The widow could feel it. The sheriff could too. The fire crackled behind them. Smoke drifted across the ruined ranch. The cowboy stepped beside her, not speaking, just standing there. The sheriff looked at both of them, then at the watching crowd. His expression hardened. The performance was over. The concern disappeared. Something colder took its place. The sheriff stepped closer to the widow. Only close enough for her to hear. The crowd couldn't catch the words. The cowboy barely could. The sheriff's voice dropped low. Stop digging, or you'll join your husband. Then he walked away and left the threat hanging in the smoke. Stop digging, or you'll join your husband. The sheriff walked away and left the threat hanging in the smoke. The widow stood motionless beside the burned ranch. The words stayed with her long after the sheriff's truck disappeared down the road. Around her, townspeople slowly drifted away. Nobody spoke much. Nobody looked comfortable. The cowboy remained beside her. You okay? No. Good. The widow looked at him. That's becoming annoying. It means you're paying attention. The widow stared at the black skeleton of the barn one final time. Then she turned away. She knew where she needed to go. The road home felt longer than usual. The cowboy followed on horseback while she rode beside him in silence. Neither talked much. Dawn had started creeping across the horizon by the time her house finally appeared. The place stood alone beyond a line of dry fields. Nothing had changed. That was the problem. The widow climbed down first. The porch creaked beneath her boots. The front door opened with the same tired sound it always made. Inside, the house waited, still, silent, frozen. The widow stepped into the entryway. His coat still hung beside the door. She stopped. The cowboy remained behind her. Neither spoke. The coat had not moved since the day he died. Dust covered one shoulder. The sleeves hung exactly where he left them. The widow stared for several seconds before continuing inside. Every room carried the same feeling. His boots remained beside the fireplace. His coffee cup still sat inside a cabinet. His tools waited on the workbench near the kitchen. Years had passed. Nothing felt gone. Everything felt paused. The cowboy looked around carefully. You never changed anything. No. Why? The widow shrugged. Didn't know how? The answer felt small, but true. The cowboy nodded, no judgment, no advice. Just understanding. The widow moved toward the back room. The old clock on the wall had stopped years ago. Nobody wounded anymore. The silence inside the house felt heavier than the silence outside. This place remembered everything. The widow crossed the hallway, then stopped suddenly. A sound echoed overhead. A footstep. Soft, brief, the widow froze. The cowboy heard it too. Both looked toward the ceiling. Neither moved. Another sound. A creak, slow, measured. The widow's pulse quickened. Did you hear that? Yes. The cowboy stepped forward immediately. The house grew quiet again. The widow listened carefully. Nothing, no movement, no voices, no explanation. The cowboy reached for a lantern. Stay here. No. Yes. No. The cowboy sighed. Fine. Together they moved toward the attic stairs. The narrow staircase groaned beneath their weight. The widow carried the lantern. Light danced across old wood and hanging cobwebs. Another creak echoed somewhere above. The widow gripped the lantern tighter. The attic door waited at the top. The cowboy pushed it open. Dust filled the air. Boxes lined the walls, old furniture sat beneath sheets. Everything appeared untouched. The widow slowly stepped inside. "Anybody here?" Silence answered. The cowboy checked every corner. Nothing, no intruder, no animal, no explanation. Eventually, he looked back at her. "House settling. Maybe." The widow wasn't convinced. Something about the sound had felt deliberate. Personal, almost familiar. The feeling stayed with her. The lantern light drifted across the attic. The widow noticed several boxes stacked beneath a window. Most belonged to her husband. Old notebooks, receipts, farm records, letters. She crouched beside them. The cowboy joined her. "What are these?" "His things." "You look through them?" "Not much." "Why not?" The widow opened a box. "Because every time I tried, it felt like losing him again." The cowboy didn't answer. He understood. Together they began sorting through the contents. Most of it looked ordinary. Old bills, repair notes, weather records. Then the widow found a leather journal. Her breath caught. She recognized it immediately. Her husband carried it everywhere during the final months before his death. She opened it carefully. The pages were packed with writing. Names, dates, meetings, transactions. The same names that appeared in the courthouse records. The same names hidden inside the letters from the well. The widow turned pages faster. Patorti transfers. Accurate payments. Conversations overheard at ranch gatherings. Descriptions of county officials meeting after dark. Every page strengthened the case. Every page connected another piece. The cowboy read over her shoulder. He kept everything. Yes. He was building proof. Yes. The widow continued turning pages. Then the writing changed. The names became less frequent. The investigations faded. The entries became personal. The handwriting looked heavier, more rushed. The widow slowed down. One entry caught her attention immediately. "If anything happens to me, she can never know how close they came." The widow swallowed hard. Another entry followed. "I think somebody is watching the house." Another. "I saw the sheriff's truck near the road again." Another. "She deserves a life without this fear." The widow stared at the page. The cowboy remained silent. The next entry hurt even more. "I should have stopped months ago. But if I stop now, nobody else will know the truth." The widow closed her eyes briefly. Every word felt alive. Every sentence carried his voice. She turned another page. The final entries were written only days before his death. The handwriting shook. The fear was obvious. The widow reached the last completed page. Then she stopped. Her chest tightened. He knew he wouldn't survive. The cowboy looked at the journal. "He was trying to save you." The widow lowered her head. "I couldn't save him." The words barely escaped. The cowboy sat beside her quietly. "You weren't supposed to." "No, I should have listened. You loved him. I should have listened." The cowboy waited. The widow wiped her eyes. "He told me something was wrong. He knew. I thought he was obsessed. He was scared." The widow nodded slowly. That truth hurt more than anything. For years she believed grief came from losing him. Now she understood something worse. Part of her grief came from not understanding him while he was still alive. The attic grew quiet. The lantern flickered softly. The widow stared at the final page. Then something unusual caught her attention. The journal cover looked thicker than it should. She frowned. The cowboy noticed. "What? This doesn't look right." The widow examined the inside cover carefully. Her fingers brushed along the edge. Something shifted. A hidden compartment. The cowboy leaned closer. "Hold on." Together they carefully pulled at the lining. A folded piece of paper slid free. The widow unfolded it slowly. Both stared. It was another map older than the last one. More detailed, and whatever her husband had hidden inside that journal all those years ago, it had been waiting for her to find it. It was another map, older than the last one, more detailed, and whatever her husband had hidden inside that journal all those years ago, it had been waiting for her to find it. The widow spread the map across the attic floor. The cowboy lowered the lantern beside it. Dust drifted through the light as both studied the faded markings. The map showed roads that no longer existed, property lines that had changed decades ago. Then one location caught her attention. A building marked near the edge of town. No label, no explanation. Just a symbol. The widow frowned. "I know this place." The cowboy looked over. "Where?" "The old meeting hall." "I thought that burned down. Most people do." The cowboy glanced at the map again. "Most people wrong lately." The widow folded the paper. "Let's go." By sunrise, they reached the forgotten building. The hall sat hidden behind overgrown trees and abandoned fencing. The roof sagged. Several windows were boarded shut. Nobody had used the place in years. At least that was the story. The widow pushed open the front door. Dust covered everything. Rows of broken chairs waited beneath shadows. A collapsed stage occupied the far end of the room. The cowboy walked slowly. "Doesn't look promising." Neither did the well. "Fair." The widow checked the map again. Her husband had marked a specific wall. 3 small symbols appeared beside it. The widow approached carefully. The wood looked ordinary until she knocked against it. The sound changed hollow. The cowboy heard it too. There. Together they pulled loose several boards. A hidden compartment appeared behind the wall. The widow stared. Boxes filled the space. Stackers of records, ledgers, property documents, meeting notes, decades of paperwork. The cowboy whistled softly. Well, the widow opened the first ledger. Her pulse quickened instantly. Names, payments, land transfers, bribes. Every secret connected. Every secret documented. The evidence was overwhelming. The widow closed the book. "We end this." The cowboy nodded. "How?" "We show everybody." That afternoon, word spread across town. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of anger. Many came because they wanted to see the widow fail again. By evening, the town hall overflowed with people. Voices echoed across the room. Arguments started before the gathering even began. The widow stood near the front. The evidence sat on several long tables, boxes. Ledgers, letters, records, years of hidden history. The cowboy stood beside her, quite watchful. The sheriff arrived late. Several county officials followed. A representative from the governor's office entered shortly after. The room grew louder. The widow stepped forward. Nobody applauded. Nobody welcomed her. That was fine. She hadn't come for approval. She came for truth. The crowd slowly settled. The widow opened the first ledger. "This belonged to my husband." Several people exchanged looks. "He died investigating missing land records." The sheriff folded his arms. The governor's representative smiled politely. Neither looked worried. "Not yet," the widow continued. "After his death, records disappeared. Silence spread. People disappeared too." The governor's representative finally spoke. "These are serious accusations." The widow nodded. "Yes, without context. There's plenty of context." She opened another ledger, then another, then another. The room began moving from table to table. People started reading, faces changed. Questions started. Then anger followed. An older rancher slammed a document onto the table. "You lied." A county official stepped back. "I didn't." "You did." Another voice joined. "My father lied." Silence followed. The speaker looked shaken. Everyone turned toward him. The man swallowed hard. "My father signed these." Nobody answered. A woman stepped forward. Her hands trembled. "We lost everything." She pointed toward a land transfer record. "Because of them." The room erupted. Voices overlapped instantly. "You stole from us." "No, yes. Look at the signatures. They forged documents." "My family was forced out." "My grandfather warned me." "They arrested innocent people." The governor's representative raised both hands. Everybody calmed down. Nobody listened. The widow watched decades of silence break apart. People weren't arguing about rumors anymore. They were arguing with proof. A farmer held up one of the letters. "Explain this." The representative glanced at it. "There may be misunderstandings." The crowd laughed bitterly. "Misunderstandings? That's your answer?" Families lost homes. People disappeared. The representative's confidence began fading. The widow stepped closer. "You knew." "No, you benefited. I represent the office. You represent the people who signed these records." The room turned toward him. The representative suddenly looked very alone. The sheriff finally spoke. "Enough." His voice echoed sharply. Several people quieted. Not all. The sheriff pointed toward the evidence. "These documents prove nothing." The widow immediately held up a ledger. "This contains payment records." The sheriff said nothing. She raised a second document. "This contains witness statements." Still nothing. A third. "This contains property theft records." The sheriff's jaw tightened. People noticed. A ranch owner stepped forward. "You knew." The sheriff looked at him. "No, you knew." Another voice joined. "You covered for them." Another. "My brother went to jail because of those records." Another. "My father lost his land." The sheriff looked around the room. The support he expected wasn't there. Not anymore. Old friends avoided his eyes. Former allies stepped away. People who once trusted him now stared with suspicion. The widow felt the shift happen. The sheriff felt it too. Power was changing hands. Not through violence, through truth. The cowboy remained beside her, not speaking much, just standing there. The widow appreciated that. She didn't need rescue. She didn't need someone speaking for her. She only needed someone willing to stay. And he stayed. The crowd kept moving through the evidence. Questions became accusations. Accusations became confessions. Several people admitted their families benefited from stolen land. Others admitted they had ignored warning signs for years. Nobody escaped untouched. The town wasn't divided anymore. It was unraveling. The governor's representative tried one final time. "We can investigate these claims properly." The crowd answered immediately. "You had decades. You ignored us. You buried it. Not anymore." The representative stepped back, defeated. The widow looked toward the sheriff. He stood completely alone now. No supporters, no allies. Only evidence, only consequences. For a long moment he stared at the records, then at the crowd, then at the widow. Something changed behind his eyes. Not fear, not anger. Something heavier. The sheriff turned without speaking. The room watched him leave. Nobody followed. Nobody stopped him. The widow tracked him through the doorway. Outside, twilight settled across the town. The sheriff walked slowly toward his truck. In one hand he carried his hat, in the other he carried a revolver. And as he disappeared into the gathering darkness, the widow knew the story was not finished yet. The sheriff walked away. The room watched him disappear through the doorway, carrying his revolver into the gathering darkness. Nobody followed at first. Nobody moved. The town stood frozen between relief and fear. Then the widow stepped forward. The cowboy saw it immediately. "You know where he's going." "Yes, you shouldn't go alone." "I wasn't planning to." The widow pushed through the crowd. The cowboy followed beside her. Behind them, several townspeople exchanged nervous looks. Nobody tried to stop them. The road behind the church felt different now. The town's secrets were no longer buried. They were exposed. And exposure made desperate people dangerous. The widow walked quickly. The cowboy stayed close. Neither spoke much. The distant outline of the old church appeared beneath the fading night sky. Beyond it waited the well, the place where everything had started to unravel, the place where the letters had survived, the place where the truth had waited. As they approached, a figure stood beside the stone wall. The sheriff, his hat rested on the ground, his revolver hung loosely at his side. For a moment, nobody moved. The widow stopped several feet away. The cowboy remained beside her. The sheriff looked older than he had a few hours earlier, tired, fetid, almost hollow. The widow broke the silence. "You ran." The sheriff shook his head. "No. What do you call it? Walking away." "Same thing." The sheriff looked into the well. "Maybe." The widow stepped closer. "It's over." The sheriff laughed once, a sad sound. "No. Yes. No." The widow stared at him. The sheriff finally met her eyes. "My father started it." The words landed heavily. The widow felt her chest tighten. "And you protected it." The sheriff lowered his head. Yes, silence followed. The cowboy folded his arms. The widow waited. The sheriff seemed to understand. No more hiding, no more excuses, only truth. "My father wasn't the only one," he said quietly. "I know, he was just the first." The widow listened. The sheriff looked toward the horizon. Families wanted more land. They stole it. Yes, through lies. Yes, through threats. Yes. Every answer came easier now. The dam had broken. The sheriff continued. They targeted families with debt. The widow said nothing. They forged records. He swallowed hard. They created claims that never existed. The cowboy spoke. And when people fought back? The sheriff closed his eyes. They made examples of them. The widow felt anger rise again. False arrests, yes. Burned ranches, yes. Disappearances, the sheriff nodded. Yes. The wells stood silent beside them. Generations of secrets seemed to linger in the cold air. The widow stepped closer. "My husband." The sheriff looked away immediately. That was answer enough. The widow's voice hardened. "My husband." The sheriff nodded slowly. He got too close. The widow felt her pulse quicken. "How? He found records. I know. He found witnesses. I know." The sheriff looked toward the ground. He found proof connecting everybody. The widow waited. The sheriff's voice nearly broke. "He wasn't supposed to die." The widow stared at him. The words felt meaningless. "He did. Yes, you let it happen." "Yes." The sheriff's shoulders slumped. "For years I told myself I was protecting the town. You were protecting criminals. Yes. I lost everything." The sheriff nodded. "I know. No." The widow stepped closer. "You don't." The sheriff looked exhausted. Maybe guilty, both. The widow wanted to hate him. Part of her always would. But standing here now, she saw something else. A man carrying decades of cowardice. A man trapped inside his father's shadow. A man who chose silence every time truth demanded courage. The sheriff looked at the well. "I should have stopped it." "Yes." "I should have spoken." "Yes." "I should have told the truth." "Yes." The word echoed between them. Final. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then his expression changed. The cowboy noticed first. Something shifted. Something dangerous. The sheriff's eyes moved toward the canvas satchel, hanging from the widow's shoulder. The letters, the evidence. The widow saw it too. "You're still thinking about it." The sheriff didn't answer. "You're still thinking about destroying it." The sheriff looked away. That was enough. The widow stepped backward. The cowboy moved instantly. The sheriff suddenly lunged forward. Everything happened at once. His hand grabbed for the satchel. The widow pulled away. The sheriff caught the strap. Paper spilled. Letters scattered across the dirt. The widow fought to keep hold. The sheriff pulled harder. "Let go." "No." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." The sheriff yanked again. The widow stumbled. The cowboy grabbed the sheriff's arm. "Stop." The sheriff swung toward him. "Stay out of it." "No." The struggle exploded beside the well. The revolver slipped from the sheriff's hand. It hit the ground. The widow scrambled toward the letters, page scattered across the dirt. Confessions. Records names. Proof. Years of buried crimes. The sheriff broke free briefly. Then the cowboy tackled him sideways. Both men crashed against the stone wall. The sheriff struggled desperately. "It's too late." "Yes," the cowboy said. "It is." The sheriff froze, breathing hard. Defeated. The fight drained out of him. The widow gathered the last of the letters. The evidence remained safe. The sheriff slowly pushed himself upright. Mud covered his coat. His face looked broken, not physically, something deeper. His badge hung crooked against his chest. For years it had protected him, protected the lies, protected the silence. The sheriff looked down at it, then laughed bitterly. His fingers brushed the metal. The badge came loose. It slipped free, fell, landed in the dirt beside the well. Nobody moved. Nobody picked it up. The sheriff stared at it for several seconds, then looked at the widow. His eyes carried years of regret, Years of fear, years wasted protecting the wrong people. It should have ended years ago. The widow looked at the fallen badge, then at the letters, then at the man standing before her. It ends now. The sheriff nodded, slowly accepting it. For the first time since she had known him, he looked relieved. The eastern sky began to brighten. Night slowly surrendered to morning. The first light of dawn stretched across the churchyard, across the well, across the scattered dirt, across the empty badge lying where it had fallen. And as the sun prepared to rise over the place where the truth had finally surfaced, the widow stood holding the evidence that would change everything. Chapter 10. Hope returned. The first light of dawn stretched across the churchyard, across the well, across the scattered dirt, across the empty badge lying where it had fallen. The widow stood holding the evidence that would change everything. For a long moment nobody spoke. The sheriff looked at the ground. The cowboy stood quietly beside her. The night had finally ended. Not just the darkness above them, the darkness beneath years of silence. By midday the arrests began. County investigators arrived from outside the town. Boxes of records left the courthouse. The hidden letters were copied and cataloged. The ledgers from the meeting hall became evidence. One name led to another. One confession uncovered 10 more. The governor's allies denied everything at first. Then the documents spoke for themselves. Resignations followed, charges followed. The stories people once whispered became facts written into official reports. The sheriff stepped down before anyone could remove him. He handed over what remained of his authority and disappeared from public life. Nobody celebrated. The damage was too old. Too deep. The town had lost too much for celebration. But relief slowly replaced fear. Families began receiving notices about restored property claims. Old records were corrected. Missing signatures were investigated. Land stolen decades earlier started finding its way back to the people who had lost it. The process took time. Weeks passed. Then more weeks. The changes came slowly. But they came. The widow watched it happen. The town she once fought against started rebuilding itself. Neighbors gathered to repair fences. Church volunteers helped families move back onto recovered land. People who had spent years avoiding one another began speaking again. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. The burned ranch changed too. The cowboy refused to abandon it. New beams replaced the ruined ones. Fresh lumber arrived almost daily. Several townspeople offered help. At first, the cowboy seemed surprised. Then he stopped arguing and accepted it. One afternoon, a farmer arrived with tools. The next day, another brought supplies. By the end of the week, half the town was helping. The widow noticed something strange. Nobody called her crazy anymore. Nobody crossed the street to avoid her. Children waved when she passed. Store owners nodded. Old women spoke to her without lowering their voices afterward. The change felt uncomfortable at first, then unfamiliar, then welcome. One morning she stood outside the rebuilt barn and watched volunteers finish a section of fencing. The cowboy climbed down from a ladder. "You're staring, yes, at what?" The widow looked around. "All this." The cowboy followed her gaze. "People? Yes, terrifying." The widow laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had not heard from herself in years. The cowboy smiled. "There it is." "What?" "That sound." The widow shook her head. "You make everything awkward. Gift from birth." Summer slowly settled over the fields. Grass returned. Gardens, conversations returned. The town carried scars. It always would. But scars meant survival. One afternoon, the widow found herself standing before her husband's grave. The cemetery looked different now. Cleaner, cared for. Fresh flowers rested near several forgotten stones. The forgotten ranch hand's grave had flowers too. Someone still visited. The widow wasn't surprised. The cowboy stood nearby beneath the shade of an old tree, giving her space, not leaving, just staying. The widow looked at the headstone. The familiar ache remained, but something had changed. The grief no longer felt like a prison. Only a memory, a painful one. but no longer the only thing she carried. The cowboy slowly approached. Neither spoke immediately. The widow kept looking at the grave. "I thought grief was all I had left." The cowboy nodded. "Turns out you had more." The widow smiled faintly. "Yes." The wind moved gently through the grass. The cemetery felt peaceful. Not haunted, not heavy, just quiet. The widow finally looked at him. "You stayed." The cowboy met her eyes. "I wanted to." No clever answer. No joke, just truth. The widow nodded. For a moment neither looked away. Then she reached into her pocket. The cowboy noticed the ring immediately. Her husband's wedding ring. She had carried it for years. Every day, every season, every lonely night. The metal rested in her palm, worn smooth by time. The widow closed her fingers around it. "Come with me." The cowboy didn't ask questions. He simply followed. The walk led them back to the church, back to the well. The place where secrets surfaced, the place where the story changed. The place where grief stopped hiding behind anger. The widow stood at the edge and looked down. Darkness waited below. Not threatening, not frightening, just deep. The cowboy remained beside her. Silent, the widow opened her hand. The ring caught the afternoon light. For a second she saw everything. Her husband laughing, working, dreaming, fighting for the truth, trying to protect her. The memories hurt, but they no longer destroyed her. She took a slow breath, then held the ring above the darkness. "You can rest now." The words drifted downward. Sybil, final, the widow released the ring. It disappeared into the well. Several seconds passed. Then a distant sound echoed from below, soft, gentle. Peaceful, the widow closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she felt lighter. Not healed completely. Maybe nobody ever healed completely. But free enough to keep moving. The town continued changing. Children played near places once feared. The churchyard filled with laughter instead of rumors. People gathered at community dinners. Old feuds slowly faded. Not because everyone forgot, because they finally remembered honestly. The widow became part of that change, no longer fighting alone, no longer standing outside every gathering. She belonged there now, not because people gave her permission, because she had helped save the town from itself. Months later, the restored ranch stood beneath a golden sunset. The new barn gleamed in the fading light. Fresh fencing stretched across open fields. Livestock moved peacefully through green pasture. The widow stood beside the cowboy near the front gate. The work was finally finished, at least this part of it. Both stared across the land, the future stretched ahead, unwritten, uncertain. The cowboy folded his arms. "What now?" The widow smiled. "I don't know." "Good," she looked at him. "Why?" The cowboy smiled back. "Means we finally get to find out." The sun settled lower, the fields glowed gold. Neither rushed to speak again, neither needed to. The silence between them no longer carried grief, no longer carried fear, no longer carried ghosts. It carried possibility. And as two wounded people stood together beneath the fading light, looking toward a future neither could fully see, hope finally took the place that silence had occupied for so many years. The story ended there, not with revenge, not with victory, but with the simple courage to begin again.